Okay, so this is pack 14 and it's about hormones again, but it's about the hormones that are involved in human reproduction. So we're going to look at those hormones. We're also going to consider the menstrual cycle, which is a series of events that ensures the release of one egg each month. We're also going to look at contraception and ways of treating infertility, and also a quick look at negative feedback of hormones. Remember, the blue slides are the page 2s in our pack. There's quite a lot of detail in this pack, a lot of stuff that you might not know about, so we've really got to study it very carefully and learn it very effectively. Just a quick recap. Remember that hormones are chemical messengers, and they are produced by glands and they are released into the blood where they travel all around the body. But hormones only affect certain target tissues. So they go everywhere, but they only cause effects in target tissues, which have receptors that match the shape of the hormones. Now, there are several hormones involved in human reproduction. Estrogen causes secondary sexual characteristics in females, and testosterone causes the development of secondary sexual characteristics in males. On this slide, there's just a brief summary of what those secondary sexual characteristics are that occur during puberty. So let's just remind ourselves of a few endocrine glands. Endocrine glands release hormones. Now, at the top of this diagram, it's not really a gland, but it's a place called the hypothalamus. It's important in homeostasis. It can detect our body temperature, and it can detect the concentration of our blood. It's also important in reproduction. But the main gland we're interested in is the pituitary gland. That is just below the hypothalamus. We've got the thyroid gland, which is in the neck, and that releases thyroxine. We've got the pancreas, that controls blood glucose levels. That's just below the stomach. We've got the adrenal glands, and they are just above the kidneys. And then in this diagram, we're only showing the female reproductive organs, because that's what we're going to be focusing on in this pack. And the ovaries, which are at the end of these little arms here called the fallopian tubes, the ovaries produce estrogen hormone and progesterone hormone. Now, we're really interested in two hormones that are released from the pituitary gland. One is FSH. It's known as follicle stimulating hormone, and that targets the ovaries. And it causes immature eggs that are inside immature follicles to grow. There's also luteinizing hormone, LH, and the big burst of LH is what causes the release of one egg each month during the menstrual cycle. Now, estrogen, one of its roles is to inhibit FSH, to stop the pituitary releasing FSH, but it also is involved in thickening the lining of the uterus. We'll see more about that in a minute. There's also progesterone hormone, also released from the ovaries, and that is used to maintain the thick lining of the uterus. So here's a summary slide telling you briefly what each of those four hormones do. Let's look a bit more detail at the female reproductive organs. On the left is a front-on view, and here on the right is like a view through the middle. as if it's a slice down the middle here. It's slightly harder to recognize the parts here. The main thing is this bit in the middle, which is the thick lining of the uterus. And that's these parts, the thick lining of the uterus. They've got really good blood supply because this is where an embryo will develop if the egg is fertilized. Now, if an egg is not fertilized within a couple of weeks of it being released each month, then these walls are not necessary anymore. And so this lining, this thick lining of the uterus, is expelled out of the vagina. Now this is called menstruation. The loss of the lining of the uterus. It's called menstruation or the period. Now let's focus for a minute on the ovaries. The ovaries, they're here, one there, one on the other side. They're at the end of these long winding fallopian tubes. The ovaries release one egg each month. Just randomly from one ovary, one egg will be released. And it will travel down the fallopian tube and it will come into the uterus here. And if it is successfully fertilized, an embryo will start to develop. And the embryo will be actually embedded in this thick wall of the uterus. So let's go back to our ovary. And in this picture, here's the ovary. And let's focus first on these immature follicles. These follicles contain an egg, an immature egg. The follicle is like a case surrounding the egg. FSH hormone that is produced by the pituitary causes one of these immature follicles to start to grow and mature. So we can see the follicle and the egg maturing as we move around this picture. Now these maturing follicles start to produce estrogen hormone. So as the follicle gets bigger, levels of estrogen increase. Now eventually, about halfway through the menstrual cycle, the levels of estrogen become really high and they stimulate the pituitary gland to release a big burst of LH hormone. Now LH is what causes the follicle to break open and release one egg. This process of releasing an egg is called ovulation. Ovulation is stimulated by LH hormone. Now the empty follicle that has released the egg, it changes slightly, but it begins to produce progesterone hormone. Now progesterone hormone is important because it helps maintain the thick linings of the uterus. We want to maintain the thick lining of the uterus for a couple of weeks after one egg has been released. The thick lining of the uterus is preparing for the possible fertilization of an egg, where a new embryo can start developing in the thick lining of the uterus. Progesterone hormone is released by the empty follicle to help keep that thick lining. So in this diagram, we're focusing just on the thickness of the lining of the uterus. This graph is showing the 28 days of the menstrual cycle. But the menstrual cycle begins with menstruation, or the period. And what that means is the uterus lining is lost. It breaks down and it is expelled from the body. That's why this graph is showing it starting thick but getting really thin over a few days when that lining of the uterus is expelled from the body. That indicates the beginning of our menstrual cycle. Now, as you'll see, when the immature follicle begins to grow, it was stimulated by FSH hormone from the pituitary. The follicle starts producing estrogen. As estrogen is produced, the lining of the uterus, the wall of the uterus, starts to get thick again. And at around day 14, the egg is released from the follicle in ovulation, and the empty follicle starts to produce progesterone hormone. So at day 14, ovulation occurs and progesterone is produced, and this helps to keep the wall of the uterus thick for the next couple of weeks till the end of the 28-day menstrual cycle. Use the slides to watch this video summarizing the events of the menstrual cycle. There is another short animation just focusing on what's happening in the ovaries. So this slide shows quite a complicated series of graphs. Now let's go through it slowly. At the top of this graph, what it's showing over the whole of the menstrual cycle from day 1 up to day 28 here, in the beginning of the next menstrual cycle, shows what's happening in the ovaries. So at the beginning of the menstrual cycle, we've got very small immature follicle containing the egg. Remember that FSH is released at the beginning of the menstrual cycle. It's follicle stimulating hormone. It's released from the pituitary gland, and it causes the follicles and the eggs inside to grow and develop. Now, as they grow and mature, the follicle releases estrogen. So estrogen is released from the follicle in the ovaries. You can see this graph shows that the estrogen is going up as the follicles are growing. Now look at this, as the estrogen goes up. Well, actually the estrogen does a couple of things. It causes the lining of the uterus to thicken. So this bottom graph here just shows changes in the thickness of the lining of the uterus. We start at the beginning of the menstrual cycle. The lining is broken down and expelled from the body during menstruation, during the period. So it becomes really quite thin. But as the follicle and egg mature, they release estrogen, so levels of estrogen go up. At the same time, that causes the lining of the uterus to build up again, to become thicker. Now at the same time, the estrogen targets the pituitary gland, and it inhibits the release of FSH. So FSH levels come down as estrogen levels go up. Estrogen goes up as the follicle grows, FSH levels come down. Now when we reach a certain really high level of estrogen, well, it stimulates the pituitary gland to release a huge burst of LH hormone. This big little spike here is a big burst of LH hormone in the blood, and that targets the matured follicle and egg, and that big burst of LH causes ovulation, the release of the egg from the mature follicle. Ovulation happens around day 14 of the 28-day menstrual cycle. Now after ovulation, the empty follicle starts producing progesterone hormone. Again, there's a graph of progesterone hormone here. It's very low for the first half of the menstrual cycle, but after ovulation we get the empty follicle. The empty follicle starts producing progesterone, and that goes up. Remember that progesterone is there to maintain the thickness of the lining of the uterus. So it keeps that uterus lining thick for the next couple of weeks. Now, if the released egg is not fertilized over the next couple of weeks, well, eventually that empty follicle breaks down. When that breaks down, the levels of progesterone go down again, just right at the end of our menstrual cycle. And remember, progesterone was there to keep the lining of the uterus thick. So if the progesterone goes down, then actually the lining of the uterus breaks down as well. And that's the period. That's the menstruation of the next menstrual cycle. Now in the slides there is another little video for you to watch to go over that information about the levels of FSH and estrogen and LH and progesterone that you find during the menstrual cycle. So after ovulation, the release of an egg, the egg moves down the fallopian tubes. Now at some stage, as the egg is moving down the fallopian tubes, if the egg meets sperm and is fertilized, then a tiny embryo starts to develop. And the embryo, the fertilized egg, actually embeds itself in these thick walls of the uterus. They've got a really good blood supply to nourish the embryo as it grows. So quick recap. Which hormones are produced in the ovaries? There's estrogen and progesterone. Which hormones are produced in the pituitary gland? FSH and LH. how long does the menstrual cycle take? The whole cycle, that is. Not just menstruation, but how long does the whole cycle take? And on which day do the ovaries release the egg during each menstrual cycle? So the whole menstrual cycle takes 28 days. The egg is released on day 14. So state 3 things that the estrogen does during the menstrual cycle. Well, it inhibits the production of FSH. It stimulates the thickening of the lining of the uterus. And at a really high level, it causes the pituitary gland to rapidly secrete a burst of LH, and that will cause ovulation. What is the main role of progesterone during the menstrual cycle? Well, it maintains the thick lining of the uterus wall. So remember to go to the VLE, go to the learning plan to see what activities you have to complete this week. Then go to the B5 section. We've got 3 packs. We're now on pack 14. The pack is there, but you've been set as an assignment in Teams. Remember, there's the slides, including those short videos within the slides. There's also a link here to a bite-sized video, which is good. And the videos within the slides are also here. And there's also a revision video. Remember, we've also got the textbook and revision guide there.